This is Part 8, Volume 1 of the New and Complete Newgate Calendar, read by Roy Schreiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Account of Richard Oaky, John Levee, and Matthew Flood, who were hanged for a robbery. Richard Oaky was a native of London, and bound apprentice to a tailor, with whom he ferved about 2 years, and then running away, got into company of a fet of blackguard boys, who procured a miferable fubfiftence by picking of pockets, and then they proceeded to the practice of cutting off the pockets of women. In order to do this effectually, one of them used to trip up the woman's heels, while the other cut off the pocket, and they generally got out of reach of detection before the party robbed could recover her legs. Thefe kinds of robberies were very common formerly, but of late years they have been very feldom practifed. Many of Oaky's affociates belonging to Jonathan Wild's gang, that infernal villain, had caufed feveral of them to be hanged, when he could make no farther advantage of them. Having thus loft his old acquaintance, he became connected with a woman of town, who taught him the following fingular method of robbery. They used to walk through the ftreets, the woman going a little before Oaky. When fhe obferved a lady walking near where a coach was turning, fhe used to catch her arms, crying, "Take care, madam, you will be run over," and in the interim Oaky was certain to cut off her pocket. But this way of life did not laft long, for this abandoned woman foon after died, in confequence of fome bruifes fhe received from a fellow fhe had ill treated, and on her death Oaky followed the practice of fnatching pockets without a partner, and became one of the moft dexterous in his profeffion. Not long after this he became acquainted with feveral houfebreakers, who perfuaded him to follow their courfe of life, as more profitable than ftealing of pockets. In the firft attempt they were fuccefsful, but the fecond, in which 2 others were concerned with him, was the breaking open a fhop in the Borough, from whence they ftole a quantity of calamanicos, for which offence Oaky was apprehended, on which he impeached his accomplices, one of whom was hanged, and the other tranfported on his evidence. Deterred from thoughts of houfebreaking by this adventure, Oaky returned for a while to his old employment, and then became acquainted with a man called Will the Sailor, when their plan of robbery was this. Will, who wore a fword, used to affront perfons in the ftreets, and provoke them till they stripped to fight with him, and then Oaky used to decamp with their clothes. However, thefe affociates in iniquity foon quarrelled and parted, and Oaky, who by this time was an accomplifhed thief, entered into Jonathan Wild's gang. John Levee was the fon of a French gentleman who resided fome time in England during the reign of King Charles II, and taught the French language to 3 natural fons of that prince. But he retired to Holland, and there died foon after the advancement of King William to the throne. Young Levee was educated at the expence of the French Protestants in London, and was then bound apprentice to a captain in the Royal Navy. He ferved as a failor for fome years, and was prefent at the defeat of the Spanifh fleet in the Mediterranean in Queen Anne's reign, and afterwards failed under Admiral Norris in his fruitlefs expedition against the Ruffian fleet in the Baltic. When the Admiral came back to England, Levee's friends recommended him to the fervice of a merchant in Thames Street, in the capacity of under clerk, for which he was not ill qualified; but being too unfettled a temper to apply himfelf to bufinefs, he declined this opportunity of providing for himfelf, and foon fpent the little money he was poffeffed of. Going one evening to a public houfe in Holborn, he met with fome thieves of Jonathan Wild's gang, who foon perfuaded him to join them in their lawlefs depredations, which at length brought him to deftruction. Matthew Flood was the fon of parents of good character, and born at Shadwell. He was apprentice to a lighterman with whom he lived a considerable time, but being averfe to a life of labour, his mafter and he parted by joint confent, and foon afterwards he became acquainted with Oaky, Levee, and their diffolute companions. The robberies committed by this gang are too numerous for recital. They were for fome time the terror of travellers near London. We fhall mention only one robbery exclufive of that for which they fuffered. They flopped a coach between Camberwell and London, in which were 5 men and a woman. The men faid they would deliver their money, but begged they would not fearch, as the woman was with child. Among the gang was Bluefkin, who holding a hat received the money the paffengers put into it, which appeared to be a confiderable fum, but on examination it was found to be chiefly halfpence. The gang fufpected that Bluefkin had defrauded them, as it was not the firft time he had cheated his fellow thieves. But they were greatly mortified that they had neglected to fearch the coach, when they afterwards learnt that there were £300 in it. Some time after this, Oaky, Levee, Flood, and Bluefkin flopped Colonel Cope and Mr. Young in a carriage on their return from Hampftead, and robbed them of their watches, rings, and money. Information of this robbery was fent to Jonathan Wild, who caufed the parties to be apprehended, and Bluefkin being admitted in evidence, they were tried, convicted, sentenced, and ordered for execution. After conviction, their behaviour was exceedingly proper for perfons in their calamitous fituation. They did not flatter themfelves with vain hopes of a pardon, but exerted themfelves by every act of devotion to make a proper preparation for their approaching end. At the laft fcene of their lives they addreffed the spectators, advifing them to take warning by their fatal end. Oaky faid that what gave him more concern than all his other offences was the burning of a will, which he found with fome money and rings in a pocket which he had cut from a lady's fide, a circumftance which had proved highly detrimental to the owner. Thefe offenders fuffered at Tyburn on the 8th of February, 1723. Singular Cafe of Alexander Day, who was convicted of defrauding feveral tradesmen. In modern times we have had feveral inftances of villains who have proceeded on a fimilar plan with Day, but as few of them have cut fo great a figure, nor any of them met with a fate exactly fimilar, we fhall be the more particular in our account of this artful villain. Day was a profeffed sharper, who pretended to be a man of fortune. He affumed the title of Marmaduke Davenport, Efq, and taking a large houfe in Queen's Square, afferted that he poffeffed a capital eftate in the north of England. He had a footman who feems to have been an accomplice with him. This man he fent to a livery stable to enquire the price of a pair of horfes, which he himfelf afterwards agreed to purchafe, and then desired the stable keeper to recommend a coachman, a man rather lufty, as he had a fuit of livery clothes of a large fize by him. The man was accordingly recommended, but when the livery was tried on, Day obferved that as they did not fit him, he would fend into the country for his own coachman. But this objection was obviated by the footman, who faying that the clothes would fit with a fmall alteration, the fquire confented to hire the man. When the stable keeper faw the coachman he had recommended, he enquired to what places he had driven his new mafter, and being informed to the Duke of Montague's and other perfons of rank, he feemed fatisfied, though he had began to form ideas unfavourable to his new cuftomer. Mr. Day, having kept this coach and horfes fomething more than a week, gave orders to be driven to a coffee houfe in Red Lion Square, where he drank half a pint of wine at the bar, and asked if fome gentlemen were come whom he expected to dinner. Being anfwered in the negative, he went out the back door without paying for his wine, and faid he would return in a few minutes. The coachman waited a long time, but his mafter not coming back, he drove to the stable keeper's, who feemed glad to have recovered his property out of fuch dangerous hands. It feems that Day made no fmall ufe of this coach while it was in his poffeffion. He drove to the fhop of a lace merchant named Gravestock, and asked for some Spanish point. But the dealer having none of that kind by him, the Squire ordered £55 worth of gold lace to be fent to his houfe in Queen's Square. When Gravestock's fervant carried the lace, Day defired him to tell his mafter to call, as he was in want of lace for fome rich liveries, but he muft fpeak with his tailor before he could afcertain the quantity wanted. Mr. Gravestock attended his new cuftomer, who gave him fo large an order for lace, that if he had executed it he muft have been a very confiderable lofer, and the Squire's liveries would have been gayer than thofe of any nobleman in London. However, on the following day he carried fome lace of the fort he had left before, nor did he forget to take his bill with him, but the perfon who fhould have paid it was decamped. The next trick practifed by our adventurer was as follows. He went to the houfe of Mr. Markham, a goldfmith, and ordered a gold equipage worth £50. Markham carried home the equipage, and had the honour to drink tea with the fuppofed Mr. Davenport, who ordered other curious articles, and among the reft a chain of gold for his fquirrel. Mr. Markham, obferving that the fquirrel wore a filver chain which he had fold a lady not long before, began to fufpect his new cuftomer, and waiting on the lady, enquired if fhe knew Marmaduke Davenport, Efq. She anfwered in the negative, on which Markham mentioned the circumftance that had arifen, and defcribed the perfon of the defrauder. The lady now recollected him, and faid his name was Alexander Day, and that he had cheated her of property to a confiderable amount. In confequence of this information, Markham arrefted the sharper, and recovered his property. On another occafion Day went in his carriage to the fhop of a linen draper named Scrimfhaw, agreed for linen to the amount of £48, and ordered a large quantity to be fent to his houfe on the following day, when he would pay for the whole. The firft parcel was delivered, but the purchafer was decamped when the linen draper went with the fecond. After this he went to the fhop of a tea dealer named Kendrick, and ordered tea to the amount of £26. The tea was fent in, and the proprietor called for payment, when Day gave him orders for a farther quantity, which he pretended to have forgot before, and told him to call the next morning, when he should be paid for it by the fteward. The honeft tea dealer called the next day, but neither the Squire nor the fteward were to be found. His next adventure was contrived to defraud Mr. Hinchcliffe, a filk mercer. Day going to his fhop in his abfence, left word for him to call at his houfe to receive a large order. The merchant went and faw a carriage at the door, and being told that the Squire had company, he waited a fhort time, during which the fervants took care to inform him that Mr. Davenport was the fon of a baronet of Yorkshire, and poffeffed a large fortune in that county. When he faw the fuppofed Mr. Davenport, he was told that he wanted fome valuable filks, and wifhed that a quantity might be fent for him to felect fuch as he approved. Mr. Hinchcliffe faid that the choice would be much better made by fixing on the patterns at his fhop. Hereupon Day took the mercer in his coach, and on their way he talked of his father, Sir Marmaduke, and of other people of rank, and faid he was on the point of marriage with the daughter of Councillor Ward, and as he should be under neceffity of furnishing a houfe in London, he should want mercery goods to a large amount. When they came to the mercer's fhop, Day felected as many damafks, and etc. for bed furniture and hangings as were worth £1000. It looks as if Hinchcliffe now had fome fufpicion, for he told him that ladies are beft judges of fuch articles, and asked if he had not a lady of acquaintance whom he could confult. He readily anfwered that he had, and mentioned a Lady Davenport as his relation, saying, "Send the filks to my houfe, and I will take her opinion of them." Mr. Hinchcliffe said he would fend them, and permitted him to take with him 2 pieces of brocade worth about £30. but defirous to know more of his cuftomer before he trufted him with the whole property, he went to Councillor Ward, and found that his daughter was already married to a gentleman of the name of Davenport. Hereupon the mercer went to the houfe of the fuppofed efquire, but he was gone off with what property he had obtained. It was likewife difcovered that our adventurer, having cafually met at a coffee houfe the Mr. Davenport who had married the daughter of Councillor Ward, had prevailed on him to call him cousin, on pretence that they muft be related, becaufe, as he alleged, their coats of arms were the fame. After a courfe of fraud, Day was taken into cuftody in the month of May, 1723, on fufpicion of having robbed the mail, but it proved that he was not the man. However, there were 6 indictments brought againft him for the defrauds. In his defence he pleaded that his intention was to have paid for the goods he purchased on credit, and he afferted that he poffeffed an eftate in the county of Durham, which he had mortgaged for £1200, but no credit could be given to his allegations, nor, even if he had poffeffed fuch an eftate, would it have appeared that he acted on honeft principle. After a fair trial he was convicted, and sentenced to fuffer 2 years imprisonment in Newgate, to stand twice in the pillory, to pay a fine of £200, and to give fecurity for his good behaviour for 2 years after the term of his imprisonment should he expire. Cafe of William Hawksworth, who was executed for murder. This malefactor was a native of Yorkshire, and was born of reputable parents, who gave him fuch an education as was proper to qualify him for a considerable trade. But being of a difpofition too unsettled to think of bufinefs, he enlifted for a foldier, in hope of being promoted in the army. After he had ferved fome time, and found himfelf difappointed in his expectation of preferment, he made intereft to obtain his difcharge, and then entered into the fervice of a gentleman with whom he behaved in a proper manner for a considerable time. But not being content with his fituation, he repaired to London, and again enlifted as a foldier in the foot guards. In this fituation he remained 4 years, during 2 of which he was fervant to the colonel, who entertained a very good opinion of him, till an incident which unexpectedly arofe occafioned the crime for which he fuffered. Before we relate the particulars, it will be proper to remark that at the period of which we are writing, party difputes ran very high, and foldiers frequently were the fubject of the contempts and derifion of the populace. While Hawksworth was marching with other foldiers to relieve the guard in St. James's Park, a man named Ranfom, who had a woman in his company, joftled him, and cried, "What a ftir is there about King George's foldiers?" Hawksworth, imagining the woman had incited him to this behaviour, quitted his rank, and gave her a blow on the face. Irritated hereby, Ranfom called him a puppy, and demanded the reafon of his behaviour to the woman. The term of reproach enraged Hawksworth to fuch a degree, that he knocked the other down with his mufket, and then the foldiers marched on to relieve the guard. In the mean time a crowd of people gathered round Ranfom, and finding he was much wounded, put him in a chair, and fent him to a furgeon, who examined him, and found his fkull fractured to fuch a degree that there was no hopes of his recovery, and he died in a few hours. Hereupon a perfon who had been witnefs to what paffed in the park went to the Savoy, and having learnt the name of the offender, caufed Hawksworth to be taken into cuftody, and he was committed to Newgate. Being brought to trial at the following feffions, the colonel whom he had ferved gave him an excellent character, but the facts were fo clearly proved that the jury could not do otherwife than convict him, and judgment of death was paffed accordingly. For fome time after fentence he flattered himfelf with the hope of a reprieve, But when the warrant for his execution arrived, he feemed to give up all hopes for life, and ferioufly prepared himfelf to meet his fate. He folemnly averred that Ranfom ftruck him firft, and faid he did not recollect the circumftance of leaving his rank to ftrike the blow that occafioned the death of the other. He declared that he had no malice againft the deceafed, and therefore thought himfelf acquitted in his own mind of the crime of murder. However, he behaved in a very contrite manner, and received the facrament with figns of fincereft devotion. A few minutes before he was executed, he made a fpeech to the furrounding multitude, advifing them to keep a ftrict guard over their paffions. He lamented the fituation of the common foldiers, who were confidered as cowards if they did not refent an injury, and if they did, are liable to endure legal punifhment for confequences that may arife from fuch refentment. However, he advifed his brethren of the army to fubmit with patience to the indignities that might be offered, and truft to the goodnefs of God to recompenfe their fufferings. He was executed at Tyburn on the 17th of June, 1723, at age 27 years. Particulars respecting Thomas Athoe Senior and Thomas Athoe Junior, who were hanged for murder. The crime for which thefe men were tried was committed in Pembrokeshire, but they were removed by writ of habeas corpus to Hereford, where, on the 19th of March, 1723, they were indicted for the murder of George Merchant, by beating and kicking him on the head, face, breast, and etc., on the 23rd of November, 1722, and thereby giving him feveral mortal wounds and bruifes, of which he died the fame day. Athoe the elder was a native of Carew in Pembrokeshire, where he rented above £100 per annum, and had lived in fuch a respectable way, that in the year 1720 he was chofen mayor of Tenby, and his fon a bailiff of the fame corporation, though they did not live in this place, but in Manorbier, 2 miles diftant from it. George Merchant, who was murdered, and his brother Thomas, were nephews by the mother's fide to the elder Athoe, their father having married his fifter. On the 23rd of November, 1722, a fair was held at Tenby, where the prifoners went to fell cattle, and there met the deceafed and his brother Thomas Merchant, and a quarrel arofe between the younger Athoe and George Merchant on an old grudge respecting their right to part of an eftate, when a battle enfued, in which the deceafed had the advantage, and beat young Athoe. The elder Athoe, taking the advice of an attorney on what had palled, he would have perfuaded him to bring an action, to which he replied, "No, no, we won't take the law, but we'll pay them in their own coin." Late in the evening, after the fair was ended, the deceafed and his brother left the town, but the Athoes, going to the inn, enquired of the ostler which way they were gone. He gave them the beft information in his power, on which they immediately mounted and followed them. The brothers stopped on the road at a place called Holloway's Water to let their horfes drink. In the mean time they heard the footsteps of other horfes behind them, and turning about, faw 2 men riding at a fmall diftance. It was too dark for them to know the parties, but they prefently heard the voice of old Athoe. Knowing that he had fworn revenge, and dreading the confequence that would probably enfue, they endeavoured to conceal themfelves behind a bridge, but they were difcovered by the fplashing of their horfes' feet made in the water. The Athoes riding up with large fticks, the younger said to George Merchant, "I owe thee a pafs, and now thou fhalt have it," and immediately knocked him off his horfe. In the interim, old Athoe attacked Thomas Merchant, and beat him likewife from his horfe, calling out at the fame time, "Kill the dogs! Kill the dogs!" The brothers begged hard for their lives, but they pleaded to thofe who had no idea of pity. The elder Athoe feized Thomas Merchant in the tendereft part, and fqueezed him in fo violent a manner that human nature could not long have fuftained the pain; while the younger Athoe treated George Merchant in a fimilar way, and carried his revenge to fuch a length that it is not poffible to relate the horrid deed with decency. And when he had completed his execrable purpofe, he called out to his father, faying, "Now we've done George Merchant's bufinefs." A great effufion of blood was the confequence of his barbarity, but it feems that his favage revenge was not yet glutted, for, feizing the deceafed by the nofe with his teeth, he bit it off, and then flangled him by tying a handkerchief tight round his neck. This being done, the murderers quitted the fpot; but fome perfons coming by took the merchants to the adjacent houfe, and fent for a furgeon, who dreffed the wounds of Thomas, but found that George was dead; and the furgeon declared that the blows he received were fufficient to have killed 6 or 7 men, for he had 2 bruifes on his breaft, 3 large ones on his head, and 22 on his back. The elder Athoe was taken into cuftody on the following day, but the fon had fled to Ireland. However, thofe who had been concerned in favouring his efcape were glad to ufe their endeavours to bring him back again. On trial, the principal evidence againft them was the furviving brother, who was even then fo weak as to be indulged to fit while he gave his evidence. But the jury, though fatisfied of the commiffion of the murder, entertained a doubt whether the prifoners could be legally tried in any county but that in which the crime was committed, on which they brought in a fpecial verdict, whereupon the cafe was referred to the determination of the 12 judges, and the prifoners being brought up to London, were committed to King's Bench prifon, where they remained until the 22nd of June, 1723, and were then taken to the Court of King's Bench in Weftminfter Hall. When a motion being made by council in arreft of judgment, the court directed that an act of the 33rd of Henry VIII. Should be read, in which is a claufe ordaining that "all murders and robberies committed in, on, or about the borders of Wales, fhall be triable in any county in England where the criminal fhall be taken, and that the Court of King's Bench fhall have power to remove by writ of habeas corpus any prifoner confined in Wales to the next county in England to be tried." In confequence hereof, the court proceeded to give judgment, and the prifoners were remanded to King's Bench prifon. Between this and the time of their execution, they were vifited by Mr. Deitch, the chaplain of the prifon, and by feveral other divines. They continued to flatter themfelves with hopes of life, till the warrant came down for their execution, and endeavoured to extenuate their crime by a variety of frivolous pretences respecting difputes between them and the deceafed. On the 28th of June they received the facrament with great devotion, and did the fame again on the morning of their execution. Their behaviour at the place of death may not be improperly given nearly in the words of the minifter who attended them. "On Friday, the 5th of July, 1723, about 11 o'clock in the morning, they were conveyed in a cart to the place of execution. When they came to the fatal tree, they behaved themfelves in a very decent manner, embracing each other with the utmoft tenderness and affection; and indeed the fon's hiding his face, bedewed with tears in his father's bofom, was, notwithstanding the barbarous action they had committed, a very moving fpectacle. They begged of all good people to take warning by their ignominious death, and were turned off, crying, "Lord have mercy on us! Chrift have mercy on us!" The bodies were brought from the place of execution in 2 hearfes to the Falcon Inn in Southwark, in order to be buried in St. George's churchyard." They were executed at a place called St. Thomas's Watering, a little beyond Kent ftreet in Surrey, the father being 58 years old, and the fon within one day of 24 at the time of their deaths. The end of Part VIII, Volume I. of the New and Complete Newgate Calendar.